Well, 27 years into democracy, racism still plays itself out in South Africa's schools. This week, we saw chaos at Hoërskool Jan Viljoen in Randfontein, where black and white parents were literally at each other's throats. Today, Gauteng Education MEC Panyaza Lesufi addressing the parents on issues of fist fighting, racism, and sexual harassment at that school. Well, to speak about how parents can help their children deal with racism, we're joined by Dr. Jerome Joorst, who is the head of Department of Education Policy Studies at Stellenbosch University in the Education faculty. Dr. Joorst, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. It seems like such a difficult question to be asking, you know, that parents should help their children deal with racism, because racism should not be something that any child is made to deal with. And yet we find ourselves here. I don't know if you're able just to see how emotional that meeting between the parents and the health MEC has been. And we've seen this over and over again in our schools. Why does it look like things are not changing at the pace that they need to?
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for having me. The problems that we face in schools, in my view, are old problems. We are still busy, and we have not learned yet how to deal with our unfinished business. So we are winning the fight against racism in schools to some extent, because there are many examples of schools where people get by and get along and make it work and understand difference. But there are also incidences, as we've seen over the past 10 to 20 years, many instances of racism in schools. And because the lived experiences of our learners tell us a completely different story. And my reading of it is that we have to connect these issues not to the broader realities in South Africa, but also in the world. The resources are getting scarcer as the inequalities between those who have and those who don't increases. And, ordinary people make a calculation and say, in order to get a job for my children, they need some sort of post-matric education, but in order to access higher education, we need to access good schools or functional schools. And we know in this country that we only have so many schools. And so some public schools become oversubscribed, while others, are just abandoned, and people don't see those schools as good options. The problem is that because of these scarce resources and many other issues, government not providing, the infrastructure and so on, there are issues where people have this us and them, ours and theirs mentality, which is not helping us. And so there are huge implications for school governing bodies and SATs, as we've seen. They're going to continue to struggle with diverse management. For teachers, they will consistently be challenged by learners who won't learn anything from them because they treat them as human beings. And for learners will continue to have twisted or dual experiences of what it means to be a citizen in this country, and obviously for the broader society, because we continue along very fragmented lines and we do not attain the social cohesion, those kind of ideals that we've set ourselves.
How do we ensure that schools become environments that are conducive to the collective learning and growth of learners? Because we know that each of them, of course, will be coming through from different homes, different social backgrounds. But what becomes concerning is when you would have on the school premises some learners using racial slurs against, some of their peers.
Yeah, the problem is multifaceted. We have the legislation in place. We have the South African Schools Act, that exercises authority over school, language policies and media policies. We have the Constitution. But what is lacking is our ethical senses. Learners, parents, teachers, school governing body members, all of us has a role to play in terms of how we speak to one another, how we engage with one another, how we address issues that would have been otherwise been solved at school level, and how this gets taken out of proportion when other role players get along. So learners, as much as parents, as much as teachers and school governors and school managers, have a role to play in terms of how we speak to each other. I think apartheid and our conflictual background, we have not had a conversation yet. We have not developed a language of how to productively engage with others, people that look different to us, that have different cultures and so on. Authority. Young people have been using this country to defy authority. Now we want to pull all of that back, and it's difficult. And so, as a nation, because we haven't had the chance to develop a productive language of engagement, we don't have that language, and the only language that we have is fighting. It's shouting each other down, not listening, being intolerant, showing force. And so learners, as much as parents, as much as teachers, as much as governors and managers, have to come together and to develop a kind of a language that we can talk to each other in more productive ways.
But that won't happen on its own, and it will require some form of education that leads and guides them in that direction. Now, to the extent that the way that we see the parents engaging, and sometimes even the educators, you describe them as being people too who lack the language sometimes to navigate these issues. So where will the solution come from?
Well, we all have to play our part. We cannot give up on the idea that schools are places of rational deliberation. We cannot shift our responsibility of taking ownership of our own blind spots, our own prejudices. We can't. We had 28 years. There has been several headlines about alleged rapes in schools. There's been the school fraternity as a whole must understand that we have to take responsibility for our own behavior. We cannot leave it up to government or to other people to help us or to guide us in some way. Parents have to take responsibility for their children's behavior, children themselves. Young people have to take responsibility for their own behavior. The school environment is not the same as the place where I hang out with my friends. There's a different kind of behavior needed. There's a different kind of attitude required. It's perhaps a more formal environment. And we have to adapt, because we're going to have to adapt to our workplaces as opposed to our home spaces, our private spaces. And so I'm saying that it's not only up to learners or young people, it's not only up to parents, not only up to teachers, but it's a collective. And we can't shift our responsibility to other people to help us or to develop this kind of language.
All right, let's leave it there for tonight. That was Dr. Jerome Joorst, the head of the Department of Education Policy Studies at Stellenbosch University.